players aren't mentioned, of course. The person who was the most important factor in the presidential election is the man who's the president of the United States, and that's what we write about.
I understand that, but he didn't even make acknowledgments. Well, you listed every other person in the campaign in the acknowledgement.
Judging from the new book by former Trump aides Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie titled Let Trump Be Trump, the attempt to downplay the role of Michael Flynn in the campaign began well before his guilty plea on Friday. Jennifer and Jamal are back, and joining me now is E.J. Dionne, columnist at the Washington Post. And E.J., let me let you listen to a little bit more of Corey Lewandowski with Chuck on Meet the Press this morning. And in this fight, he's saying that he did not know, as campaign manager, what Don Jr. and Jared Kushner were up to in the campaign.
Is it possible that Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner would do things and not tell you about it?
Well, of course, Chuck, because, you know, that happens on every campaign. And you know what I learned when I went on the campaign trail and when I left the campaign? I would go to an event and they'd say, Donald Trump said you need to do this. I said, well, I know that didn't come from the candidate. Or Dave Bossie said the event has to be run this way. And I'd call Dave and say, did you say that? He said, of course not. So people take liberties all the time and do things that aren't either told to the campaign manager or just think that it's in the best interests of either themselves or the campaign.
So, EJ, there's liberties, you know, in planning events without telling the boss, and there's negotiating foreign policy with Russia. Does that make any sense to you, what you just heard?
Well, I think a year and a half ago, Corey Lewandowski would want to tell us he was in the loop on everything and a really decisive figure. And as this story advances, I suspect he's not going to want to be in the loop on anything. I think it was kind of, you know, when you think about who was an ancillary figure in the campaign, it was far more Corey Lewandowski who left the campaign than Michael Flynn, who we all remember led the Republican National Convention in cries of lock her up. So I don't expect anything from Corey Lewandowski on the Russian investigation or on collusion. That's not in his interest, and I don't think he's going to go against his own interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's listen to David Bossie, too, Jennifer. We'll let him talk. And his sort of main claim to fame is that he is a long-standing member of the Get Clinton Club, and he was also associated with the campaign. Here he is denying that he had any campaign contact, or that there were any campaign contacts with Russians.
Well, I do believe that he will incriminate others in the administration. Otherwise, there was no reason for Bob Mueller to give Mike Flynn this kind of a deal where even in a factual basis, you can see there are other crimes that could have been charged. Whether that will lead ultimately the president, I simply don't know.
Well, that was Adam Schiff, and he was saying that he thinks that Michael Flynn will incriminate other people. But now here's David Bossie.
Can you definitively say that there were no Russian contacts between the campaign? I've talked to Corey Lewandowski about this 100 times at this point. I've not interviewed you. Was there a single Russian interaction that you ever witnessed?
Not even one. And this investigation's been going on for a long time, and there's not I just don't put out there that there's a scintilla of evidence that shows Russian collusion. This president, then the candidate, that was not part of the campaign. I never saw a Russian. I never saw a Russian at Trump Tower. I never interacted with one. I was never on an email about one.
Jennifer, there are Russians who live in Trump Tower, but he never saw a Russian. Not one Russian. Not one.
Yeah, well, first of all, we all saw public collusion by Donald Trump trying to encourage the Russians to release Hillary Clinton's emails. By the time we get done with this, no one is going to remember that Donald Jr. was on the campaign. This is going to be denial. The rats are leaving the ship. No one knew anything about anything. No one knew anything. And at some point, you know what? It doesn't matter at all because Robert Mueller marches on. He's going to get the facts. He's going to get the evidence. And so these guys can say whatever they want to get to an interview with Chuck Todd, but ultimately the special prosecutor is going to figure out what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jamal.
Could I just say that one of these days Republicans in Congress will want to forget that Donald Trump was even their candidate.
Who was he? We don't know who that is. Okay, here is Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, talking about the question of obstruction of justice. And this is interesting because it's a question of who's investigating that. And this is for you, Jamal.
The Judiciary Committee has an investigation going as well, and it involves obstruction of justice. And I think what we're beginning to see is the putting together case of obstruction of justice.
And you know, Jamal, I think a lot of Democrats have come to understand that even if the Senate Judiciary and the House, well, the House isn't 100%, you know, as aggressive, but if they were to even come up with something that was a finding that looked like obstruction, that doesn't mean that politically anything is going to happen to Donald Trump. Have Democrats caught up with the notion that the only way that there will ever be accountability for whatever it is that's found by Robert Mueller or by these committees is for the Democrats to control one or both houses of Congress? And are they going to tell voters that at some point?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Democrats have got to get to the majority in the House or the Senate, probably the House, because you've got to start impeachment proceedings in the House in order for them to get to the Senate. And you may even be able to find enough Republicans, you know, in the Bob Corker, Flake, you know, John McCain, Patriot wing of the party that are willing to come out in favor of this. Look, here's what we know when we pull back. What we know is there's a quid, which is that the Russians went out and tried to help Donald Trump win the election. We know there's a quo. Donald Trump is doing everything he can to try to dismantle U.S. leadership around the world. The question is, where's the pro in the quid pro quo? And that might be where Flynn is. He's the one who can figure out where the collusion or the conversations and tie these things together. But we know Donald Trump, if Vladimir Putin was trying to find somebody to help him, he couldn't find a better accomplice than Donald Trump today.
Yeah, maybe the Democrats should offer the Republicans more tax cuts in exchange for cooperation on investigating Russiagate. Let's go to the Roy Moore race in Alabama. EJ, I'm going to come to you on this. This is Mitch McConnell, who has been, you know, he's a very canny individual. He held an entire Supreme Court seat for Donald Trump to be able to fill it. He's muscled through this tax hike on the middle class to give more tax breaks to the wealthy, and is nonplussed when Democrats say they couldn't read it. On Roy Moore and the question of whether Moore should be in the Senate, here is Mitch McConnell's answer.
Do you believe that Judge Moore should be in the Senate?
I'm going to let the people of Alabama make the call. This election's been going on a long time. There's been a lot of discussion about it. They're going to make the decision a week from Tuesday.
EJ, the one thing he doesn't want to have is to have control over. He doesn't care, I guess.
Well, I think that we should by now realize that you can't really trust what a Republican leader says one week, because if the political circumstance changes, they're going to say something else another week. And clearly enough, Republicans down in Alabama have rather astonishingly united around Roy Moore that Mitch McConnell doesn't want to fight them. He also looked at that narrow majority on the tax bill and said, better somebody who faces these accusations than a Democrat in the seat. So he's come to agree with many of those Alabama Republicans, it looks like. He just doesn't want to get in that, but I doubt he wants Doug Jones elected.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that, you know, Jennifer, may be because Mitch McConnell and other Republicans are looking at the polls, not of the overall electorate, but of just Alabama Republicans. Only 17% of whom, according to a recent poll, believe the allegations against Roy Moore. Only 17% of Republicans. With numbers like that, why shouldn't national Republicans just go ahead and throw their arms around the guy?
Right, you know, maybe do the right thing. Wild ideas like that, you know, morality, children, forget that. What I think is significant here is do not believe for a moment that if Roy Moore is elected, those Senate Republicans will move to kick him out. There is no way in heck they're going to do that. If they won't speak up now, after he's elected by the people of Alabama and after he starts voting in favor of the tax bill, do you think these guys are going to have the nerve to kick him out? I don't.
Yeah. And Jamal, I wonder if Republicans will ultimately be made to pay a price for having Roy Moore in their presence if he wins. Are Democrats capable of pulling that off?
Democrats will hang Roy Moore around every single Republican candidate's neck going into the 2018 elections. And you got a president of the United States, as Chuck Todd kind of went into this week, who is going to campaign for Roy Moore, not in Alabama. He's going to go to northern Florida in the Panhandle, where he can be in a media market that touches Mobile so that he can try to support him. We have a president who's been accused of sexual abuse and a candidate who's been accused of child molestation. And they're going to be together virtually on the campaign trail. This is one of the lowest points in Republican politics. Democrats are going to have to take advantage of it.
But, EJ, aren't Republicans who are impervious to this kind of criticism or, you know, any charges of hypocrisy, you know, that is their one talent, is that they don't hear it. They didn't care that Donald Trump had been accused by multiple women, the Roy Moore thing. They just simply start yelling, well, what about whatever Democrats? What about Al Franken? What about, even if they're not the same kind of situation, won't they just say, point at Democrats and say, we don't care?
That's exactly what they're doing. But I think you touched on something earlier in the show that's very important. There are some Republican women and many Republican independents down in Alabama who are quite conservative, but their conservatism says to them what Roy Moore did was really wrong. And so everybody talks about a hidden vote in a race like this. Roy Moore, people not wanting to admit that they're supporting him to a pollster. There could be a hidden vote the other way. Very conservative women and some men saying, I really can't admit I'm voting for a Democrat, but I actually don't want Roy Moore in the Senate. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see if that side of the hidden vote emerges.
Yeah, absolutely.
God, EJ, I hope you're right. I really do hope you're right.
We like what EJ's right, absolutely. Well, we shall see. Thank you very much to a great panel, EJ Dion, Jennifer Rubin, Jamal Simmons. Have a great Sunday, guys. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thanks. And up next, a reality check on why Donald Trump's voters put him in the White House.
Director Comey also said that while they have no proof, we assess that it is possible that hostile actors gained access to Secretary Clinton's personal email accounts. You were communicating on highly sensitive topics. Why wasn't it more than a mistake? Why wasn't it disqualifying?
Who is able to sort out the very difficult options being presented.
You're talking about
and then
judgment.
Makes the decision. There are ways of talking about the drone program.
And you said you thought your communications
that the United States alone could not do.
Right, but you said you think you're going to cheat.
Look, this is an important issue.
After Matt Lauer hosted a live primetime commander-in-chief forum for NBC News last September during the presidential campaign, there was widespread criticism accusing Lauer of treating Hillary Clinton unfairly, interrupting her ad nauseum, and grilling her about her emails, while treating Donald Trump with kid gloves and failing to fact-check his lie about opposing the Iraq War. Clinton herself was among the critics who believed Lauer's performance was sexist. This week, she was asked about Lauer, who was fired as host of the Today Show after a woman colleague made a detailed complaint accusing him of inappropriate sexual behavior. Clinton's response, quote, "Every day I believe more in karma." Now, Matt Lauer did indeed help shape the narrative during the most contentious presidential election in recent history, as did Charlie Rose, and certainly Mark Halperin, Glenn Thrush, and Bill O'Reilly, men who are all on the ever-expanding list of giants in the media who are facing allegations of sexual misconduct. Most of these men have been fired. Thrush has been suspended. And though those are positive steps, given that other men accused of this behavior continue to have their titles and are running for office, hint, hint, those actions beg the question, did their allegedly troubled history with women affect the outcome of the 2016 election? And joining me now is Gretchen Carlson, former Fox News anchor and author of Be Fierce, Stop Harassment and Take Your Power Back. Lauren Duca of Teen Vogue, Nayyera Haq, former senior advisor at the State Department and former White House senior director, and Jennifer senior director, comma, and Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post. I'm conflating everybody's titles. Thank you so much. This is a perfect panel to talk to this about. And I'm going to actually come to you first, Lauren. It's great to have you on set, first of all.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. You wrote a piece that said sexual misconduct doesn't have a political ideology, what Hillary Clinton taught you about feminism. What sort of tease it out for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that something frightening that's happening here is we're having a lot of whataboutism in kind of comparing these men across the aisle. And I also wrote, I feel like they're being treated like human dodgeballs. It's sort of, you know, you have one, we have one too. And I think we need to think of this as an issue of women being degraded and undermined at such a pervasive level that it's practically a guaranteed part of the female experience, and not the political power that can come from certain accusations, to use the power of men being held accountable to further oneself politically or have those kind of gains will pervert the Me Too movement. And I think we need to stick to treating each other with respect as a core founding principle and not red or blue.
No, absolutely. And, you know, Gretchen, I think you clearly agree with that. But the question becomes, does somebody's attitudes toward women, the clear disrespect that it takes to sexually harass a woman and think that a subordinate in your office, a young up-and-coming producer, is prey for you, right? Is there a connection between that and a general attitude toward women? So I want to play you a couple of sound bites.
Sure.
Matt Lauer questioning Hillary Clinton's stance on the Iraq War. Take a listen.
I asked before for people to raise their hand if you served in Iraq. Can you do it again? Mm-hmm. How do you think these people feel when the person running to be their commander-in-chief says her vote to go to war in Iraq was a mistake?
There was a mistake. Now, my opponent was for the war in Iraq. He says he wasn't. He supported it before it happened. He supported it as it was happening, and he is on record as supporting it after it happened. I have taken responsibility for my decision.
Let me go to another
He
veteran.
refuses to take responsibility for his support.
Let me go to.
Okay, so PolitiFact has a PolitiFact meter on that, which says that that is actually true, what you just said, that, that Trump saying he opposed the Iraq War is false. That was a September 2016 ruling, the same month as this forum. But here's Matt Lauer now questioning Donald Trump about his war stance.
I happened to hear Hillary Clinton say that I was not against the war in Iraq. I was totally against the war in Iraq.
And he didn't question him about it.
I remember watching that at the time. See, I think there's a couple of things at play here. I think it's also a network trying to make it look like they were also not opposed to Republicans, right?
Yes.
And being easier on Trump. That was my first impression on that. And then being tougher on Clinton's because the mainstream media sometimes is accused of being more liberal, right? But also sexism. Listen, this has been going on both political parties. Remember with Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton? They both got horrible treatment in the media. And when you started this segment by showing all those powerful men being able to have control over the messaging that we're giving to America and the world, that is so crucial to point out as you have.
Yeah.
Because we need to make sure that we're showing our young girls that they can be whatever they want to be, and seeing is believing. And when you don't see women in powerful positions, and when you see them being interrupted like that, that sends a signal to our young people that they can't be those political figures.
And if I could just, you mentioned Sarah Palin, I think it's important that you did that because she, people I think have a visceral reaction to her on the left when you say it. But there was one of the ways in which that she was treated that doesn't get talked about as much, which is that her hotness, her appearance, right, was sort of built into the way that people described her appeal.
Yeah, or Hillary Clinton's pantsuits.
Yeah.
You know, or how her hair looks, or how her makeup is. We never talk about that when we're talking about men. It's all a form of sexism.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go to you, Naira, on this, because Jill Filipovic, who sort of inspired the segment with this New York Times op-ed that she wrote on Friday, she says the following. She says, and it's called "The Men Who Cost Clinton the Election, Sexual Harassment and the Sexism It's Predicated, often involve more than the harassers and the harassed. When the harassers are men with loud microphones, their private misogyny has wide-ranging public consequences. One of the most significant is the 2016 election." Is it sort of sour grapes by people who wanted Hillary Clinton to win to say that, wait a minute, now that we know in retrospect that some of these men were harassing women, aha, they are to blame? Or is there something to this argument that their underlying attitudes may have shaped the way everyone thought about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think this is a moment where we all start to question our own inherent bias and how have we all contributed to this pervasive culture of sexism. And it's a women and man problem. Women also, this idea of a game girl, somebody who just goes along to be the cool girl. And I've paused and questioned what times were there when I was in national security that I didn't pause to maybe question a superior and how he was behaving or treating another woman, or the casual sexist comments that they were making while we were discussing serious matters. It's a spectrum of behavior that doesn't start and end with abuse. It starts with the kind of sexist behavior you're talking about and the rampant misogyny that makes women feel diminished in the workplace. Add on the layer of the national security work, in which a lot of the work is done in isolated situations where you're separated from your family. Loyalty is considered a high priority in the job, and we work with security clearances. We literally can't take our phones into certain places where we work, so we can't record and have evidence of any of this bad behavior. This burden of proof that women have to bear in certain sectors is even more challenging than what we've seen for people in the media.
Yeah, and Jennifer Rubin, as somebody who writes about national security and writes about these sort of man issues, right, that people would normally associate not necessarily with a woman writer, there's just the level of disrespect for the opinion of women, that's one level of it, all the way up to the disrespect of women's bodies. You know, you're along that range, but is it too much to try to conflate those two things and say, wait a minute, this could actually swing an election?
Well, I don't think it's too much to conflate it, and it happens also in what's not shown. If there was enough coverage of Donald Trump's, I don't even want to say dalliances because that sounds trivial, but really predatory behavior with women, which was known before Access Hollywood. If there was as much coverage of that as it was of Hillary Clinton's emails, do we think the election would have come out the same? I don't. It was the willingness to ignore, to say, oh, it's just about sex, it's just about his private life, it doesn't have any relevance. that contributed to Donald Trump's normalization, which was, I think, the greatest sin of the media in the election, treating him like a normal person, running a normal campaign, saying normal things. And the red light should have been flashing on, and they should have been investigating, you know, down to the 14-year-olds who he was oogling outside the Trump Tower. But it wasn't. And part of that is because of these misogynistic men, and part of it is simply because there are not enough women in positions of authority. Yeah. If you had more women 100%. At the top, it would have been less harassment, and it would have been more coverage in a more gender-neutral way.
Yeah, you're getting amens here. You know, I think about Pizzagate on the one hand, which is a crazy conspiracy theory alleging a sex ring run by Hillary Clinton in a pizza shop, which is crazy. And then I think about how many women it takes for people to finally say, you know, Roy Moore might actually be guilty of child molestation. You have to get to 14, or how many women does it take? I mean, the thing is, though, we're denying the reality of the way these stories were told. There was a column in The Week, and it used this metaphor of, it's like the sexism of these men, the acknowledged, you know, admitted to sexual predation of these storytellers is like turbulence in a nosedive. And I think it's like finding out the pilots have been drunk. I think that that's a lot closer to what happened here. Gretchen brings up, you know, overcompensating for perceived bias against Trump. Hillary's likability was the biggest weapon they used to do that. Mark Halperin talked about the Hollywood Access tapes, calling it a moment to be celebrated if that's all they have. I mean, these men laid an infrastructure in which undermining and degrading women could be carted off as locker room talk. And that's all part of the things we were willing to accept. And the idea that men who knew that there were skeletons in their closet refused to come down hard when other skeletons were exposed is significant in Hillary Clinton's loss and the loss of every woman who has been pushed out of a job and made to feel intimidated in a world where this is treated as something that's okay. Yeah, I mean, that idea of women have to be likable, it is down to sort of, you know, Hillary Clinton's ankles were accommodated. Is she the type of person to be likable? Is she scheming? Is she, you know, all of those sort of variations on a sexist
theme. It's like
theme.
The media already saying, when are we going to hire back the predators? You know, when will they rehab themselves, instead of doing what I've been advocating for companies to do, which is hire back all the women who've lost their jobs as a result of having the courage and the bravery or the fierceness to come forward.
And how would the narrative have been different if the women who were pushed out of the business were telling the stories of the election rather than the men who remain?
Or if we had higher women in the media making some of these decisions.
And we can't vacuum seal off this private, disgusting, predatory behavior from their full worldview. And the reality is their worldview were informing so many of our cultural and political stories.
Yeah, and Naira, you know, I think that, you know, it all does look like sort of rehashing the election, but we have other elections to come. And the question is whether or not the sort of, you know, the ways in which we talk about candidates based on their gender has changed at all, and whether we've learned that lesson based on what we've seen happening to these powerful men. And there is the point, too, that Gretchen makes. You know, Gretchen's not on Fox anymore, right? Bill O'Reilly isn't either, but neither are most of his accusers. So have we really learned anything?
This is part of the challenge, I think, with the election cycle, is that politicians are ultimately accountable to voters. When people don't vote, we are not holding our representatives accountable. In a business context, you have mechanisms for removing people for HR violations. And even then, when we've seen it's a more direct chain of command, that it takes several women, several accusations, and an understanding that this person has generally been a bad person in order for them to get fired. So that threshold seems to be even higher for politicians. The really only solution is for women to engage, women to vote, and for men who are allies to engage on what have previously been known as just women issues and should be known as cultural, social issues.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I mean, for women to vote, but women don't necessarily, women are getting the same messages that men are, right? The media is feeding everyone sort of the same underlying messages. So how can we decouple women from what they're also getting back about the way you should be likable, the ways that you should be viable, et cetera?
Right, and you know, ultimately this is on the voters. There was all kinds of polling out there on Roy Moore, but one of the more stunning figures is that Roy Moore is winning overwhelmingly among white women. Ladies in Alabama, get your act together. This guy is not someone who you want to be elected. This is not a message you want to send to your daughters and your sons. What are these women thinking? So yes, I think it's on both of us, both men, both women, to really think about the consequences of people that they are putting in positions of authority, what that signals to their own children, and what behavior then is countenanced, what behavior then becomes socially acceptable, not a barrier to great success.
Yeah,
and I think women and men have to think about that really hard.
The most disappointing thing to me, I totally agree with you, is that what I have seen happen over the last 16 months since my story broke, in this divisive nature that we live in, is that people are putting policies ahead of human dignity, including female voters. I mean, look at some of the voters down in Alabama who say, even if you tell me 120% that Roy Moore is guilty of these charges, I'll still vote for him instead of the other political party. So we need to have a big kumbaya moment within our own culture and say, we're going to put human dignity first. Otherwise, I don't see a lot of positive outcome for our children and what they're learning.
Last one too.
To get back even to the first comment, this has to be seen as something that can't be separated from who these men are politically. I don't care if it's Al Franken, and I don't care if it's Roy Moore. And you can't separate a man from his values when he's making these kind of decisions. And the reality is, a vote for Roy Moore is a vote for sexual predation. A vote for Donald Trump was a vote for sexual harassment. Policies and character cannot be fully separated in the way politics affects our lives, and we have to say no to this as the way we treat women.
Absolutely. Well, this is a great start. Thank you all for such a thoughtful, smart discussion. This is a terrific panel. Gretchen Carlson, Lauren Duca, Naira Hawk, thank you, thank you, thank you. Jennifer will join us again later on. And stay right there. Up next, the top Republican strategist who's been sounding the alarm about Donald Trump. Steve Schmidt will be here when we come back.
My experience with USAA.
The former head of John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign, Steve Schmidt, has not Steve Schmidt joins me now. That regular order comment leads me to the question I want to ask you. I'm going to hold off on that first because I cannot resist reading you some quotes from the Republican Party back in 2009 and 2010 about the passage of the Affordable Care Act. This is Paul Ryan. I don't think we should just pass bills that we haven't read, that we don't know what they cost. That's Paul Ryan. We shouldn't rush this thing through just to rush it through for some artificial deadline. Let's get this thing done right. And one more, Congress and the White House have focused their public efforts on platitudes and press conferences while the substance and the details have remained behind closed doors. Meanwhile, what we saw overnight Saturday, Steve, were handwritten changes. We're going to put them up on the screen, being penned in to this bill at the last minute. Democrats who had been given like maybe an hour or two to read a 500-plus page bill, and 6,000 lobbyists approximately working on the bill. Does the Republican Party, are they aware of this hypocrisy, or do they just not care?
Well, a couple things. Good morning, Joy. When you have a situation where Democratic United States senators, say the two from the state of California with a population of 38 million people, when they are unable to access the language of the legislation for the purposes of representing those 38 million people, and the way that they get to see the language is by having it handed to them by a lobbyist who's working with the Republican leadership to write the bill. What that means is the United States Senate, which used to be called the world's greatest deliberative body, that has just gone completely off the rails. And I'm somebody who wants to see a fundamental reformation of the American tax code. I love the idea of cutting taxes. I love the idea of cutting top marginal rates. It makes my heart flutter and makes me go wobbly in the knees. This is not that. This does nothing to lift the wages of working class Americans, and that's the #1 economic problem we have in the country. It adds $1.5 trillion to the debt. It is a massive corporate tax break paid for by the middle class of the country. It is as irresponsible and reckless a piece of legislation done as ship-shottedly as you could possibly conceive of. Real disservice to the American people here. And I think there'll be a big consequence for Republicans in November of 2018, because remember, what they're hailing as a victory has a 25% approval level with the actual human beings in the country who will vote.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your excoriation of the bill the idea that these are the same people who are talking about return to regular order. And you worked for John McCain in 2008. He was the main person who was demanding regular order be returned. It's why he voted against the appeal of the Affordable Care Act. What do you make of the fact that he turned around, he and other people who've been critical of the process, turned around and voted for this bill?
Joy, you're going to have to go ask those senators what the reason is. It's inexplicable to me if you take what they say at face value here. It certainly wasn't in the regular order. There was no emergency for it to pass that evening. And once again, just like in the health care bill that they voted earlier, they don't have the final costs. They don't know particularly what it's going to do. It just shows the complete and total collapse of rigor around the policymaking process in this country. This is not how we ought to be doing multi-trillion-dollar legislation that affects 100% of the American people. It's just not.
Yeah. Beyond just the tax bill, there's so much going on all sort of at the same time. You also have the question, a lot of people have begun to question, quite frankly, Donald Trump's stability. You've started to hear murmurs even off the record from Republicans about it. You've heard on the record murmurs about it from people like Bob Corker. And even beyond just whether he's completely stable, there's been the questions about what he's doing to the country. This is John McCain talking about Donald Trump back in October. And he said, we have to fight against propaganda and crackpot conspiracy theories. We have to fight isolationism, protectionism, and nativism. We have to defeat those who would worsen our divisions. We have to remind our sons and daughters that we became the most powerful nation on earth by tearing down walls, not building them. Yeah, Jeff Flake gave a pretty dramatic exit speech along the same lines. Yet we haven't seen Republicans actually do much or take action, and they really seem to just fall in line behind Donald Trump, no matter what he does. Explain to people who do not understand why that is, in your view.
Well, Joy, here's what I think, is that you have 100% of the Democrats, 60 to 65% of independents, and roughly, and I'm talking about voters, not elected officials, 20 to 25% of the Republican Party that just stands in absolute opposition to this president, to his divisions, his malfeasance, his incompetence. And we look at this week, the racial insult in front of 90-year-old United States Marine veterans, combat veterans, the Navajo code talkers. We look at the reality this week, his tweeting of al-Qaeda propaganda, his praising of a British neo-Nazi far-right paramilitary group, which earned him the condemnation of parliamentarians in both parties in the United Kingdom. We have the situation where the American president cannot set foot in Great Britain for fear of permanently damaging the special relationship. You want to talk about a danger to the national security of this country, the estrangement from our closest ally, certainly you can't get much higher than that. And of course, we have an escalating nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula with a president that, when you just look at his actions from a layman's perspective, seems to be increasingly unstable. And the Republican Party has discarded every principle that it's held dear on matters of policy. It has gotten in line behind a president who degrades his office, who divides the American people. They're complicit in it with their silence. And I think that there is one question on the ballot in November of 2018, and it's, do you want to put a check on President Donald Trump? And I think that the answer to that question in the overwhelming majority of the American people is yes. And there's going to be a coalition of people, I suspect, that don't agree with each other on very many policies, but agree 100% with each other on their concept of fidelity to the Constitution, to the rule of law, to what makes this country a very special place.
Yeah, well, Steve Schmidt, you never mince words, sir, and it's really great to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joy. My pleasure.
Thank you. And up next, how Republicans are trying to defend their terrible, horrible, no good, very bad tax plan. States when it fired a missile that experts say is capable of reaching targets throughout the continental U.S. But 3 days later, the North Korean leadership was signaling a willingness to try a different tack when Russian lawmakers returned from a visit to Pyongyang with this offer: According to what one of those lawmakers told Russian state-run media, North Korea is willing to negotiate with the United States as long as the negotiating table also includes a seat for Russia. Joining me now are Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund, and retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. And Colonel Wilkerson, I'll go to you first. What do you make of that offer that Pyongyang is willing to negotiate as long as Russia is involved?
Joy, what we got here is rank amateurs in Washington and one of the most accomplished diplomats in the world, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow, serving an increasingly accomplished KGB-trained master of chess, while in Washington we play checkers. In other words, Russia from Mitrovica and Kosovo to Georgia to the Baltics to the Balkans, everywhere, Russia finds crevices, pours itself into them, and exploits the amateur hour in Washington. Putin is a chess master. He's moving pawns, knights, he's moving bishops. He's castled even with regards, for those out there who know something about chess. And he's beating the heck out of these amateurs in Washington. Yeah, this is the latest example.
And you know, one of the people who is in charge of this response in Washington is H.R. McMaster, who said the following at yesterday's forum. It was called the Reagan National Defense Forum. This is General McMaster.
So has the potential of war with North Korea increased since this latest launch?
I think it's increasing every day, which means that we're in a race, really. We're in a race to be able to solve this problem. It is a race because he's getting closer and closer, and there's not much time left.
And Joe Cirincione, does that mean that Washington, because they feel they're in a race to solve the problem, would be more amenable to the Putin offer?
Well, it depends who you're talking to in Washington. And Joy, thank you very much for devoting time to this. As McMaster said, the risk of war is growing every day. I think we're closer to war with North Korea than we have been at any time in decades. This is very serious, but we're distracted from this by the multiple domestic crises that we have. And this new missile they launched on Tuesday, this is a serious new step for them. This is a monster missile that brings the entire United States within range. So you can see how serious this is. Fortunately, there are signs of hope. The story you just cited about the Russians. The North Koreans are practically jumping up and down saying they're willing to talk, they're willing to talk. The Chinese tell us this, the Russians tell us this, the South Koreans tell us this. In Track 2 interchanges, that is informal talks between Americans and North Koreans, they tell us this. And there may be a ray of hope. The South Koreans just last week asked the United States to suspend the joint military exercises that we do every winter, starting in February and March, in lieu of the Olympics that are taking place in Seoul in February. They call it the Olympic truce. The UN has passed a resolution in favor of this. So there may be a ray of hope if this administration is capable of seizing on it. If we can still keep the pro-diplomacy forces intact in the administration, we may be able to open up talks with the North Koreans that could de-escalate the situation, eventually freeze the North Korean nuclear program.
Yeah, and Colonel Wilkerson, that is sort of a rare, hopeful note. Is there a possibility that the Olympics, which, you know, in thinking about it, it actually makes the whole prospect even more frightening, right? Even more people, an entire international community essentially assembled on the Korean Peninsula and incredibly vulnerable to whatever it is North Korea would want to do. Is there a chance that instead of making it more scary, that the pending Olympics might actually push negotiations forward?
Well, I don't want to discount the possibilities that Joe just outlined for you. They are possibilities. What I don't see is the ability to take advantage of them, or even the willingness to take advantage. What I see is the president tweeting and doing quid pro quos that are matching Kim Jong-un for everything he does, and our pros aren't as good as their quos. This warrior Vigilant Ace, I guess it is, that's coming up with more than 230 aircraft over the peninsula is the latest case in point. This is very, very antagonistic. This is sticking our finger in Kim Jong-un's eye yet again, and one wonders what his riposte is going to be. I don't see the kind of orchestrated effort that I would hope to see if what Joe's projecting were to come true. What I do see, as I said, is a bunch of people who think that this is too clever. This is too clever by half, Joy. I think they think they're going to scare Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang into negotiations, and they're not. There isn't any strategy beyond that. Yeah. He has to surrender.
And you know, Joe, to that point, you know, you have Trump continuing to be just sort of flippantly, you know, derisive of Kim Jong-un. So if in fact there isn't an effort underway to try to tamp down tensions, this is Donald Trump again using that silly rocket man smear against Kim Jong-un in a completely out of context situation on Wednesday.
Small business groups across our nation, retailers, restaurants, manufacturers, grocers, contractors, support this plan. We have tremendous support for this plan. Tremendous. Because these massive tax cuts will be rocket fuel. Little rocket man, rocket fuel for the American economy. He is a sick puppy.
And Joe, that was supposed to be a speech about tax cuts. He threw in the gratuitous attack on Kim Jong-un. And meanwhile, the people who have to do what you talked about and try to negotiate something ahead of the Olympics are short-staffed. The State Department has no nominee for Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, no nominee for South Korean ambassador. Who's actually doing this negotiation?
That's exactly right. You know, I saw that clip while it was happening, and he can't help himself. I mean, he can't help himself. He derides the North Korean leader, insults him, has no effort to come to negotiations. And here's the real tragedy. Rex Tillerson, as Secretary of State, has decimated the State Department. Just this week, we had two former Secretaries of State, John Kerry and Madeleine Albright, unprecedented, criticizing their colleague for the damage he's done. So he's taken away all the people that could do the negotiations, and now he himself may be replaced by a war hawk, Pompeo, the now CIA director, and then Tom Cotton coming in. So you see, this is what Larry's pointing to. You don't see the willingness to negotiate. You don't see the team of people that could handle these intricate negotiations. If an enemy had done this to us, we'd be declaring war on them. But this is what the administration has done to the United States, put us in a very dangerous situation with an incoherent policy that has no hope of stopping North Korea at this point, unless they dramatically switch gears in the next few months.
Yeah, to say the least. Thank you very much. Two of the best to talk to about this, Joe Cirincione and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Thank you both. Appreciate you both.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Joy. Thanks. And up next, Donald Trump's fake news mantra is spreading around the globe.
Us. It's what this country is made of.
Published reportedly shows African migrants being showcased by auctioneers as if they were property, as smugglers sell them to the highest bidder, some for as little as $400 each. Joining me now are social and political commentator Lola Adesoye and Tian Niang, political activist and co-founder of AconLightingAfrica.com. Thank you both for being here. And Tian, I'm going to come to you first and ask you to explain to us how on earth this modern-day slave trade is going on, how long has it been going on, and how long have people known about it?
Joy, listen, this is something that's been going on around the continent for a while now. People have been talking about it for a long time. I myself traveled to the other part in last year I did, and also went to those camps and visited, actually, in the Italian side, those young people who went through these same problems that we're talking about today. It's because there's a lot of issues that's going on. Here in Africa today, you have the youngest population in the world. More than 200 million young people live in the continent. And these young people have no education, no opportunities, no access to health care, no access to, basically their future is very, very blurry for them. And then when they look at social media to see what's going on to their counterparts around the world, they want to live like that. And they're risking their lives, basically, to take these boats and try to cross on the other side, chasing a dream sometimes that doesn't exist. And this is the reason why you have hundreds of thousands. The UN has told us that 150,000 young people has crossed this past year, and 3,000 of them has died. We've been sharing on social media that's what's been going on. But until CNN came out and talked about it, nobody really wanted to act on it. Since the Libya issue, when you had NATO that dismantled what happened in Libya with the leadership of Gaddafi, then after that you have a country that's empty there with no leadership, basically. Not a state that's been able to control what's going on. So in the result of that, you have smugglers, you have human trafficking, and now to slavery. And this is something that the whole world is watching, and very little is being done.
Yeah.
Starting here in Africa with the leadership that we have. What you see today in Libya is failed leadership of African leadership here in Africa first, and then it's a global issue that needs a global problem. Everybody is at fault in this issue.
Absolutely. And I want to play just a little bit, before I come to you, Lola, of the CNN report. And this is a migrant named Victory who was sold into slavery in Libya. And here is his voice.
On my way coming, I was sold. So after I was sold, they asked me to demand a ransom. When they are dying every day, no phone call, their family will be thinking that person is dead. He has lost his life. Know that he's just in one place suffering.
First of all, there's no way to say that that is fake news. That is actual victims talking. No. But, you know, you and I talked offline about the fact that Europe is not, you know, without fault here, or at least without being a part of this story. And the New York Times had a report that Europeans wanted the migration stopped.
Sir, we'll be right back.
Say hello to Joe, man of business on the go. His Duluth built